So I think further ado, we'll have to get going. I'd like to welcome you to Oor Vyce's third roundtable. We've got a rare panel, a wheel kint faces an act for you all, and I'll introduce each of them in a wee minute there. I'm Phil Reid, for those of you that I ken me. In fact, most of you when I ken me, because I've sort of, although I've been a Scots speaker all my life, I'm fairly new to Oor Vyce, and I'm the membership secretary who are there. I'm a Doric loon for Aberdeenshire by doing in Edinburgh now, but have I kept the Doric going strong. And for I'm not doing this, you can find me busy in the sort of digital experience world out there. So we're going to news about the topic standardisation of Scots spelling. We're going to concentrate specifically on the spelling aspect to it, rather than the wider topic of standardisation around words and grammar, because that's a whole topic, I'd say, and I think that's even more contentious if you could do there than maybe the spelling itself. And as some of you, as you'll no doubt ken, the main aim of Oor Vyce is to achieve a Scots Language Act at the Scottish Parliament, with the idea of getting a Scots leid board funded, much in the same way as the Gaelic board. And I would say that standardisation isn't, for us, our sort of our initial sort of objective to do, but ever since we launched the website, had Facebook up, there's been many a comment and question about spelling, and sometimes that's about our own spelling from we do a post, because we're off of different bits of Scotland. So for me, write Scots, we tend to far back in the Scots that we ken ourselves. So what we were keen to do was provide a platform for the topic, and get some experts that we've got here in Acht, and thought it was a really interesting discussion for the wider sort of language community out there. So enough about me rambling away. I'm going to introduce each of the panel, and starting with Pauline. So Pauline comes for us for the Scottish Language Dictionary. First, she's worked for a couple of years now, Pauline, haven't you? You're currently working in the role of Editorial Language Consultant, and you worked on the 2005 supplement to Scottish National Dictionary and on the revised edition of the Concise Scots Dictionary. So it's a topic you'll ken well and night.
Indeed.
Next up is Bruce Eunson. Bruce is Scots Language Co-ordinator for Education Scotland. And as well as that, he's a writer, poet and filmmaker. He's on the board, he's a board member of the Scottish Language Dictionaries, council member for Scots Language Centre, and co-convener of Shetland Forwards, and editor of the Scots Language and Culture course in Open University. So a busy chiel. Next up, we've got Matthew Fitt. For most of you all ken, Matthew is a Scots maker and Domney, and as well ken to one of the co-founders of Itchy. He's author of a science fiction novel, Button Ben a Go-Go, which is written on Scots, and as well as that, has published Scots translations of the Raymond Briggs the Snowman, Charlie Mackessie's The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse, and Asterix and Caesar's Laurel Bonnet, to name a couple. And last but not least, we've got James Puchowski, and James is a linguist at the University of Edinburgh, where he's writing a PhD, and I've got an awful lot of big words to read out here, on the socio-linguistics of language activism in Catalonia, Norway and Scotland. And he's also a translator of Scandinavian languages. So welcome to you all the night, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come along on St Andrew's night. So I think for further ado, let's turn to some of the questions for the panel. We've had a guy puckle questions sent through to us, so I'll spear some of them at you for this, but we'll not have time to get through them all. So if you didn't hear your own question being asked, then I'd be disheartened. we'll do our best to get through what we can. And we'll also keep an eye on Facebook Live. So please do comment and spear away on there and I've got some folk for the committee helping me keep an eye on that, because as you can see, I had enough of trying to get live on Facebook, which I'll never hear the end of for the committee for this, I'm sure. So first of all, I'd like to spear to each of you, and I'd start with yourself, Pauline, for your own perspective. What's your initial thoughts on the standardisation of Scots spelling?
Being a lexicographer all my life, we have to do evidence-based and try and keep our own prejudices at the door. And evidence-based means we decide on, for example, the headword in a dictionary would have to be the amount of examples we have of that headword. The problem you can get with that is, of course, that a lot of the written Scots is Central Belt and not Shetland or Orkney or Northeast. So we have to strike a balance with what we choose. And in my opinion, trying to standardise the spelling of Scots is in a way like trying to help cats, because if we, and we can't, let me say this categorically, in the dictionary, we cannot be seen to be handing down how something should be written, because we can't pass judgment. We have to, as I keep saying, it all has to be evidence-based on what. So, for example, in the past, and in the dictionary, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here, but sometimes, for some reason that is lost in the mist of time, quite often the headwords in the big dictionaries, and I speak for the modern period, I don't speak for the dictionary of the older Scottish tongue. They quite often would use an English headword, which I still can't get my head around. So the headword for hoose in the DSL, Dictionary of Scots Language, is HOUSE. And I don't know if everybody would agree, but hoose should be spelled HOOSE. But maybe no, maybe you would like it spelled HOUS or other ways. So that's me said my piece.
Thanks, Polly. I'll pose the same question to yourself, Matthew.
Well, thanks very much, Phil. I'm in two minds about this, because we didn't have at the moment a national agreed standard for Scots. There are standards, and we'll talk about some of these standards later. Standards, they exist, but we didn't have an actual standard Scots. We can that, so that's what's about today. But I'm not that bothered, because from the point of view as a maker, as a writer, as a scriver, I can function just the job without a standard. I can write I can write without needing to have a standard. I've got no problem at all. The folk who demand a standard for me is standard, like a high standard of writing for a start, or as high as I can make it. But it's the folk that read my books, because I want them to understand it, and therefore I'm responsible to them. But I'm not responsible to a standard as such. However, as I said at the start of this, I'm in two minds about this, because I think I would be glad for there to be a standard for a number of reasons. First of all, we could stop the endless debate about a standard and get on with things. That would be the first thing. But also, I think it would raise the status of the leid. a lot of folk think it can't be a language if it's not got a standard. I've had this flighting for folk around Europe. You know, how can that be your language if it's not a standard? Well, for me, I'm fine with that. But so I would like to see a standard, and I would be glad if it existed. But at the moment, for my purpose as a writer, and I would suspect a lot of other writers, I didn't need one at the moment. But if one comes along, I'd be happy.
Thank you. Bruce, what about yourself?
Yeah, we're very much in agreement with both Pauline and Matthew there. Pauline spoke well about the need to be evidence-based, and education is very similar. You want there to be educational benefit behind any educational policy. That's the case for the whole country, and it's important no matter what aspect of the curriculum you're speaking about. And Sam, as Matthew was just saying there, a standard hasn't maybe affected me personally at all, but I am aware that there's a lot of new, or what would you say, there's more people coming forward now saying they'd like to learn Scots than maybe there has been in the past. People who aren't coming from a background of, I speak a wee bit, or I speak a pretty bit at home. It's coming from people who want to learn it, but they have no Scots, and a standard would be good for that. So it's very much in line with what Matthew said about the status and the profile of the language. So I can see the benefits that there would be in having one.
Yeah. And for your own perspective, James.
I mean, this is really interesting to hear. By the way, I don't speak Scots, so those of you watching thinking, what the hell is this voice coming out of my mouth? I grew up in High Wycombe, which is a town outside London. I moved to Scotland in 2013. And so I've had plenty of exposure to Scots during my time in Edinburgh and having travelled around. But importantly, my research brings me to Norway, brings me to Scandinavia. It brings me to a country where a language is spoken. And actually, in many respects, there are quite many similarities between what happened with Scots and what happened historically with Norwegian. The point is that there's a lot of dialect variation in Norway. And historically, like with how we write in English today as a kind of a default, historically, Norwegians would have written in Danish, and that was the language of the bureaucracy. It was a language of educated speech and educated people in general. Now, on standardization of Scots, I think what I would say is that we have a very strange, well, we have a very typical view of how standards work. We think of one standard and we think of it representing one type of speech. The truth is there are plenty of cases around the world where you can have a language existing conceptually, Scots, for example, but it can actually have more than one standard. It can have room for movement. So, for example, Norwegian's a fantastic example of that. Not only are there two ways of writing Norwegian, we have two official orthographies of the Norwegian language, but there's also variation within both of them. So if you come from a particular dialect region, you can potentially write in a way that's more representative of how you speak. The same can be said, for example, for languages like Romansh, which is spoken in Switzerland. There are many different standards of that language, as well as Corsican. And the term for any language nerds out there is what we call a polynomic standard. I think Scots is a very good example of how we can create that. The only problem is that we live in a world where we're competing with the ideologies around English. And when somebody asks you, how do you write a language? There's usually one or two ways of writing English with very minor tweaks in spelling. That's it. And if we're going to basically put forward a standardization case for Scots, we need to be quite assertive that Scots is a multi-dialectal language. It's a language that is mutually intelligible with English, but at the same time, it has lots of variation. And we're able to write in it in a way, I think, that is, that represents that variation. But, it comes down to determination. And I think there are still going to be people out there thinking, yeah, but we need to have one way of writing. And that's a very typical way of thinking, because since the 1700s, that's typically how most developed nations have thought about their writing systems.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting stuff there. Does anybody want to have any comment on any of the answers you've heard from the other panelists there?
I'm interested in what Matthew said, that he's no bothered. And the thing is, the way Matthew writes is very much how Matthew speaks. Sometimes when I'm reading what you write, Matthew, I can hear you in here. So
Sorry.
I just think that it's if we try and standardize it, you're in a way you're kind of hemming it in. You're limiting it. That's what I'm trying to say, I think. And I don't know. I just didn't think you can have a standard that would go from Hoyok to Largs to Shetland to Lerwick. I just cannot see that we could, that it is in any way possible. But I'd be delighted to be proved wrong.
That maybe leads quite nicely into a question for our members that were sent in, and they were spearing, would on a new standard be prescriptive or descriptive? This is how it should be spelled, or this is how it's currently spelled. They were wondering, would you be marking up new spellings that nobody will ever use, or would you embrace the dozens of different spellings for Letterkenny to Sca or Ska, I would say. But yeah, so Pauline, I would just building on the back of what you were saying there. I think you would be more sort of erring on the less prescriptive.
Oh,
side.
aye, definitely. And I forgot to mention Ulster Scots T and O.
Aye, yeah. What about the rest of the panel? If there was a new standard pulled together, who would you see that working in the more sort of prescriptive side, or more sort of as a guide?
Can I say, Phil, it's a long way from where we are the new to hen whatever standard, prescriptive, descriptive. Ken, it's I'm much more interested in who we get from here to there, if that's what we're going to do. And I wouldn't be that bothered if there was I keep saying I wouldn't be that bothered, but it's not that I wasn't that bothered. I know that I'm in 12 minds, Pauline. That's what it is. Seemingly in my mind and your mind at the same time. but I think that a standard of any kind. We've been doing this for an awful long time. There's the makers in the 1940s came out with the Scots style sheet, but before that, Clive Young promotes a very good standard or set of spellings from the 1920s, and that's something that's kind of there's folk who've been trying to do this for a long time. It's just that nobody's ever done it or set it or managed to climb to the top of the mountain and lay down tablets of stone. That's not what I'm saying. That would be very prescriptive if it was tablets of stone. But there's been no consensus to get to that point. So maybe it's jumping the gun a wee bit to imagine how a prescriptive, because I would hate a prescriptive spelling system, but as a writer, because I would hate, if having had years of folk telling me I didn't speak right, didn't speak English right, I would bridle and fecht and spit and scarp at a prescriptive standard, but I would respect it. And I think it would move us on for where we are. But perhaps maybe our question is who we get to a prescriptive or descriptive or polynomic. Thank you, James. That's a new word to me. Standard or standards. I'd prefer one standard because you keep your eye on it.
And Bruce, for a sort of education perspective, do you think the lack of a standard spelling prevents sort of anything on the attainment side of things?
Not right now, no. But you'd never know where the next generation, what position they'll be in. So I think it would help future-proofing, if you want to say that. The basis of the language right now, you can still get into schools across the country in Finn Scots speakers. You can still expect there to be a teacher, maybe not the one class teacher, but someone in the school who has skills in Scots that you can use in the classroom. But you never ken what might be coming next for the language. And if a standard was to help attract new speakers and to strengthen the base numbers of speakers, then that would be a good thing. There's, but I'll say this, it's a LACO standard hasn't held it back in education so far. People have been, like Matthew and many afore, and hopefully many to come, have been finding a place and bringing Scots into schools for a long time, and it's done very well. So it's not held it back to this point, but maybe we're going the long way round. I don't know.
Can I jump in there a wee bit? I would agree with Bruce, absolutely. But any of the things you hate today when you're working with bairns and scales is that you have to start with their dialect. I mind being in a scale in, where was it? Perth to Glasgow somewhere, down in Pollock. And the bairns there had been doing Scots. And I thought, this is brilliant. My job's done here, I didn't at the end. And so they had their English word child and they were translating that as bairn. They'd been from Dundee, no problem with me. But I said, well, what about your word for it? And they said, well, the English word is child and the Scots word is bairn. I said, well, what? He's not got another word, this is Glasgow. Well, there's this word Wayne that we use, but that's just our word. It's not a real word. It's kind of, so there was a hierarchy developing there already. And so what I've learned is, and a lot of other folk have learned working in scales, is you've got to start with a dialect that the bairns have. And it's also helpful for folk like myself and Bruce to, I'm sure you do it, Bruce, you kind of, when I go to parts of Scotland, I try to tune into the way the bairns are talking to try and, or the Waynes, to try and kind of help them out with their Scots. And sometimes the teachers know for the area, and that can be a good and a bad thing. It gives the bairns an experience of it. But I mind a couple of years ago, there was an example of this is kind of back to the prescriptive thing, but I mind there was a bairn who was reciting something in a concert. He was doing a bra job with it. He was great on the stage in front of everybody, and there was somebody for one of the, there was a Scots language expert there. I think he was a judge, and I kent him, and he was a good lad. But what happened was that the laddie had said the word, he was battering away in Scots, and I think the one rhyme was heaving, and the next end line rhyme was seven. The laddie was really into it, and he's full of confidence. Out he comes, heaving, seven. And this man, he got up and told him off for not saying the Scots word seven, not saying it properly. And the laddie's confidence just psyched out of him. And that's what this is about, is confidence with the bairns. And the question would be whether a standard in schools, a standard Scots in schools would give bairns confidence, or whether it would not. I think it might give teachers confidence. So it might take a good application, but that's just how I feel about that.
We did have actually just jumping ahead to my script. We did have a question in, and somebody was spirited us as standardization for schoolies and their teachers, or for your dictionary screevers, I said. So they kind of thought that Wayans that had never spelt a four, so they're going to be spelling this youth that would be Cadrecht Y. But Faz going to tell the markers, poets, screevers, and Fitt tweeters that they've been doing it wrong all these years. Was somebody who said it there. So, but I suppose it is great for new folk coming to the languages as well. James, I just had one for you. Just jumping back there. Has there ever been a minority language which was revitalized without having a standard spelling?
It depends what you mean by revitalization. When we talk about a language coming back to life, you have to remember that languages are not like objects that exist out there. They're not like animals going extinct. Actually, when we talk about language, we're talking about speakers. We're talking about people who have that language with them. They have that ability to communicate with them, and it's about giving them their confidence to use the language. you know, the reason why I talk about Norwegian in comparison to Scots is primarily because it's a very clear example of a society in the 17 and 1800s where people who wanted to be educated, people who wanted to go to school, were basically speaking Danish with relatively Norwegian accent. And that's probably something you can do comparably with how people today might speak Scottish Standard English. Now, things have moved on, and you kind of have these kind of transitionary lects in the middle, and then you have kind of the more Norwegian traditional Old Norse ways of speaking. But altogether, they see that language together as Norwegian. So you can have some really conservative people who speak in a way that's quite close to Danish, and they write in a way that's quite close to Danish. But on the other hand, in Norwegian, you still have people writing in a way that's quite, you could call old-fashioned, or kind of more rural, or more kind of, you know, historic. But ultimately, it comes down to how people overall conceptualize what the language is. Now, we've talked a little about school. I think the reason why we like standards quite a lot is because we really like this idea, especially in the industrialized world, that you teach a language with a red pen. Okay, that's how you best teach a language. That's how you best kind of get your kids to know how to learn a language. Because if you can tell them that's wrong, that's right, that's wrong, that's right, that instills with them a sense of basically, you know, they know what to do, like a programmable language. But, you know, in Norway, in the 1800s, they very clearly made the law, once they started to talk about the Norwegian language existing separate from Danish, that at school, kids will have the right to use their language in school, and the teachers have no right to correct them. That was revolutionary back then. And that's the sort of legislation that's continued alongside the creation of a Norwegian standard, whereby basically, even today, you go on TV, you go on the news, you watch, for example, a documentary, people speak their dialect. And the only time a standard is used is when somebody, a newscaster, is reading out the script in front of them. So you have this kind of relative linguistic equality. It's not a dialect paradise. There are hierarchies. There are certain dialects which represent certain classes of people, economic classes and stuff, what have you. But there's a general more feeling, and you know, that you can have a language, because if, for example, Norway hadn't got its autonomy in 1814 and it had continued part of Denmark or Sweden or what have you, it's very likely that the sort of conceptualization of a Norwegian language wouldn't exist the same way today. If you can call that revitalization, maybe you can. But there are other cases around the world where there are languages that have different variations in spelling. Catalan is an example. That's my other language. Although you have standard Catalan, there are Valencian spellings and Valencian grammatical differences. And you have, for example, the same on the Balearic Islands. I think maybe the issue, again, that I think we've come across is that we have to convince people. A major hurdle to doing good things with Scots is convincing people that this is a language, an autonomous language in its own right. And the first thing that people might think is, oh, how do you say this word in Scots? That sounds like English. You know, and it comes very kind of weird when you try to explain, you know what, a language is not determined simply by its difference from another language. Most of the time it comes down to the determination of its own speakers. So I really hope that, you know, as we go forward, whether or not we have one standard or several, or variations in between, that we remember that it's more about kind of having that confidence that a language exists and that there is variation, and that it ultimately comes down to the freedom of expression to use a dialect, as we've seen, for example, in places like Norway, where kids grow up speaking their dialect and learning dialects of other people.
And listening to that, Pauline, just to go back, when you were saying you'd be very hard to do these in Scots, you think there are parallels that we can take for Norway or Catalonia? And
I don't know enough about these distinct languages and dialects. I'm sure I've read a bit about the Norwegian situation and how that came about. And I mean, Matthew bear me out in this, but in the time that I've been in the world of Scots and dictionaries, we have come huge ways for the teachers gain me lines as a bairn for speaking Scots. I mean, when I grew up, Scots was the language of the playground. There was no way. And now, I mean, I can remember when teachers were being, Matthew, you'll know better than me, but nowadays, teachers are strongly discouraged for correcting bairns talking Scots and making them speak English. Am I right in that?
I would say it's no they're discouraged, because why is going to discourage them? But I think the main thing is that there are many more teachers now who have a much more positive tack on what Scots is. And I mind, not long ago, a teacher who had said that when they started their teaching career, they thought it was their duty to correct bairns for no speaking English properly or whatever. She'd changed her mind, and because she'd seen the way that laddies in our class in particular had responded to just a wee bit of Scots, and how they'd gone from being bottom of the class to being the best pupil in the class. And just because she'd seen the evidence wherein is, she said, I remember she said this at an in-service, it was doing at Langley Education Centre in Gala, and she said in front of quite a few other colleagues, I now feel it's my job to teach Scots. And I think teachers go on a journey with us, and they see the benefits. It has to be a positive thing, and prescriptive has already
Absolutely.
come up, etc. This is and it's the positivity that has been transmitted by lots of folk. It's folk here the nicht, and folk maybe listening in, and folk who didn't even ken this is on or didn't even care, you know. But this is something this is what gets us places, we Scots. And I think the only way for it is to take some of that positivity and the stories and the experiences for Norway and for Catalonia, where they have been successful, maybe try and work out how that happened. It seems that in Norway it was part of an independence movement, and Catalonia too was in reaction to as the Irish seem to be going through repression for other parts of that peninsula. But that's in response. But at the moment we have a situation where we're concerned about this. There's more and more folk in Scotland who want to see Scotland in a better place. I think more and more folk are enjoying their Scots. They're enjoying expressing themselves. But it's peery steps. It's peery steps. That's what for you, Bruce. I was going to say PD, but I changed it. Just to really move for it with that positivity, and it's going to take an awful long step. But we've been making muckle leaps in the past 30, 25 years, the past 5 years, and with Oor Vyce starting today where it's doing, that's another positive thing. So James, I hear you. It's kind of like a dream world. It's like a fantasy you're describing.
Actually, it's really important I say it's not like paradise, and I think people need to kind of come to grips with there's still an educational system in all the places I've mentioned. And I think I've read in the Facebook comments somebody was saying, you know, Valencian and Balearic are their own standards. Yes, but even within Standard Catalan there are people who still write in different variations of spelling, and there are people who would argue that all three of those standards are technically the same language because they share a common base of literature. But I mean, again, it's not something that a linguist like myself, you know, I'm more actually very interested in my research with the discourse and how people talk about these things. It's bloody interesting how people kind of think about these ways. But linguists traditionally, you know, when in the past they've policed what a language is and what language isn't and what's a standard, what isn't, they're usually just implicit in a good part of that conservatism that has been part of, you know, educational theory for a very long time. And there are other ways of doing it. Now, you're always going to have limits as to what you're going to do. You know, I can speak Norwegian and I can speak with my Swedish friend, and I still know that if I start including certain Swedish words in my writing or how I'm speaking, there will be a point when people are saying, you're not speaking Norwegian anymore, James. And I say, yes, you're probably right. So there are kind of things you can do, but it's about kind of having the maximum amount of variation within that norm. And I think the problem that we have is that whenever we had like the synthetic Scots, the Lallans, the spelling sheet of the 1940s, a lot of the reaction was, I don't speak like that. Or, you know, that's not my language. Or you have people who are like saying, even now today, like, oh, Scots is getting too anglicized People are using these English words all the time. The question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the language you hear on the street? Okay, what is the language you hear from people day to day? That's the Scots that lives today. There's going to be a lot of variation. There's going to be a lot of people who use some words and don't use the others. How can you create a standard that best encompasses all of that? And that's not for me to say. If anything, I'm going to be sat in the back with a clipboard monitoring how things are going on, and seeing, what sort of decisions are made. Because I think, as Oor Vyce and Jack Capener have said before, we're going through a bit of a renaissance right now with regards to how we're thinking about language in Scotland. There's a bit more self-confidence. We're seeing it through our media. We're seeing it through public government. It's a really cool and interesting time. But I think it's really important we stop ourselves from getting into the old ways of thinking, because there are other ways out there if we're looking for that democratic and liberation kind of type of way of writing. So I'll stop there.
I'm not going to say much more, but I like what you're saying.
Yeah,
I think that's very,
There is
very.
a wee bit of theme. Sorry, Matthew.
No, it's like,
There is a wee theme coming through for some of the comments that I'm seeing is far with the standardization before. It's something that's coming through because you're seeing Scots written more through today than you might have way back in the 80s with Facebook and Twitter, and folk are starting to really enjoy the way that they speak and expressing themselves that way. So it's just like far we would be doing this for, I guess.
And it's the answer to that is that new speakers. Is it that we want the language to grow and to be learned by people who aren't going to do it through immersion by being on the street, that they're going to learn it from a book or an app? Is that one of the pros? Is that a good thing that we're looking at for Standardising Scots? It's that we can attract the new speaker who can learn it on their own without having to immerse themselves in a community.
I did do some homework for this stuff through, and I was reading about Basque and what they did there. They came up with a standard maybe 20-30 years ago, and initially nobody really spoke a standard, but as new speakers and folk have moved into the area, the new standard Basque has started to become a lot more accepted further. Just on so here I am, a Doric speaker and living in the Central Belt and that. But if we're speaking about standardising things, could it lead to some sort of leveling out to the the regional dialects of Scots like mine, Shetland, and I suppose food to make sure that Elkie speaker plays a part in it. So it shouldn't just be about the Central Belt. Yeah,
it's I think that that's where identity really comes into it as well, isn't it? I think something that sometimes people forget if they're not from a dialect speaking area is that, or that they don't know, is that someone in a dialect speaking area is as proud of the features that make them distinct from the centre as any Scots speaker is about what makes them distinct from an English speaker or a Gaelic speaker or any other language. Although all the features that you've used in your own house, in your own family, that you've written down, all these little details and nuances, pretty nooks and crannies of languages and dialects are really important. And just go back to education for a second. One of the big reasons why people like myself and Matthew promote that teachers should use the local dialect is, well, quite often that teacher is going to be a dialect speaker. Just being a teacher doesn't mean you exist in a different social sphere where a completely different set of language rules exists that they might be from that community. So you need that confidence from the teacher as well. It's an important point.
I mean, I think initially when I moved down here and I started reading more sort of Central Belt Scots, it did take me a wee while to sort of get my head around it, and I sort of read it in Doric, sort of translated it into Doric. I did get my thinking, Fitt can be done to sort of support parents, I guess. So if their bairns are coming home, we sort of things a mere a standard sort of version of Scots Fitt can be done to support the parents at home, do you think? To be mere?
Well, that's where is that parent a Scots speaker already or not? You know, if the parent is a Scots speaker, then I assume Scots is being used in the home as it is. Mm-hmm. And I think that any parent, say you're reading a bedtime story, you'd probably read one that you recognize as, I can say these words. You know, you're not going to read a bedtime story that you don't understand and you're just guessing until you finally get to the last page and hopefully the parent's asleep.
I just struggle with partons and brocks, I have to say. There's something that exists in Aberdeenshire that I can, but every day is a school day. And I guess when we're speaking about all this, I mean, there's a lot we can learn for the Gaelic community, I guess, as well, and their experiences. And obviously, we'll be reaching out to them over the coming months. I'm just having a wee look at some of the comments that are coming through. Oh, formal writing. So Scots has already been standardised for the individual dialects in a sort of more organic way, but fit about formal writing, official documents. Should we have 5 different versions? I suppose.
Who says we need formal writing? That's the question that I would ask in return. Why registers develop organically? I think the question is, do you need to write in such a distinctly different way from the way you speak? So in Norway, I mentioned there are these 2 standards, these 2 official ways of writing Norwegian that have variation within both of them, but 2 rough ways of writing. Nynorsk and Bokmål, literally New Norwegian, which was created as a new alternative, and Bokmål, which is this Danish, Norwegianized Danish that's used by the majority of Norwegians today anyway. And in both these, they have style guides as to how to write formally. And in Nynorsk, they're quite ideological. They basically say you're writing a letter to somebody who's of a higher status than you. I mean, that doesn't really exist in Norway because it's quite an egalitarian society. But it's like just write as you speak. Just don't use the passive. Just say, you know, if you're writing because there's a pothole in the road, you know, you can just write, I would like somebody to come and fix the pothole. Many thanks. And your name, and that's sort of way that they'll be expecting you to write. Bokmål, because it's based in Danish and the old-fashioned kind of ways of thinking, they've kept some of their stylistic things. That's not to say, of course, that you don't have these registered differences. There's always going to be an element of formality in the way that you write. Don't swear, don't insult people, you know, stuff like that. But there are different ways of going about it. And I think, you know, if you really want a standard that's also got a formal register, the question is, you know, what does that say about the society that you live in as well? Is that also really the sort of kind of way that you want to use the language, you know, to complain about potholes in the road, for example? So.
I suppose it depends on the audience or the readership. And there is formal writing in Scots. Myself and quite a few other folk have been involved in translating for the Scottish Parliament. There's not been many requests for the past wee while, but I mind doing a document for the Culture and Sport Committee. It's about 500 pages long. It was riveting stuff. But any of the problems we had with that is that taking it straight from English and translating it into Scots, most of the words are Latin anyway. And all you're doing is maybe juggling about, maybe putting an O-U-N instead of an I-O-U-N instead of an I-O-N. And then try and find opportunities to bring in common Scots words that folk are going to identify the document as a Scots document.
Deleting lots of G's off the endings of words.
Exactly. I try to find this exact line. And so it's kind of Sayre work doing that. And because a lot of the vocabulary, I mean, there is lots of great Latin vocabulary, but most of it is less used or perhaps obsolete. And then so a document could be produced that nobody could understand without access to Pauline's dictionary or whatever. But it's a kind of a juggling act that, and it kind of, I've done it a number of times. Other folk have done the same thing. there are translation companies in Scotland who do get requests every now and then, and they come to me or they come to other writers, or it's mostly writers, because they've got experience of writing in Scots, or the translation company have heard theirs. But a standard would help there, because it would be simply referring to the standard for the translation. And of course, I mean, James, attacking your point, to hear a document in English in the passive voice, and then to have a sort of a more, what would be, I don't think it would be great. I think it would be much more Scottish. It would be much more us to hear it in a kind of a first person narrative. You can imagine the folk would be looking at that rather than the English document. But again, that would open it up to us. That's a ridicule. And so formal Scots, I mean, there's, you hate to go back a bit, but there are court records, borough records for the Middle Ages in Scots. They borrowed heavily from French, and a lot of the language in that is kind of French, in the rang and immersement of court, etc. So there is precedence, but I think whoever was asking about formal writing, we have to have formal writing, and if a standard helps us get there and makes it easier for folk to use Scots in a formal setting, then why not, without having to do this juggling act to try and make it work and make it acceptable.
Just thinking back, Pauline, to what you were saying earlier about, and it came to the how do we even get there? What do you think the steps that we would need to take to get a form of standardisation, even to get folk on board? What would on day one of the Scots Language Board, when they get together and decide that this is a way for it, what would they need to do to get the ball rolling?
Pauline through the short straw there.
Well, I mean, it's open to anybody. It just, I mean, obviously, if we could start, it would have been done afore now, but
I just don't have an answer to that. I mean, I specialise, as I keep saying, in trying to both promote the language. Don't get me wrong, I'm not at all prescriptive in any way, and maybe that's the problem, that I've got to keep the balance of recording what people say, recording what, and sometimes I have to make judgments. I have to make judgment calls. For example, if I'm in the heady days when I stood at a bus stop, standing at a bus stop, and I hear somebody say something, and I think, oh, and I make a wee note. But then that's my judgment on how I think that would be written down, because I've no evidence other than what I've overheard. Now, if it's a word that's a common word, I'm less likely to write that down, because there's going to be plenty of evidence for it in the dictionary anyway. But if it's something less common, or something that I think, oh my goodness, somebody's still using that. That was supposed to be obsolete in 1650. And that does happen. Trust me, that absolutely happens. I have to make a judgment. So, yeah, if a standard is achieved, no doubt to achieve the standard, they would have to use the DS Dictionary of Scots Language. I mean, but who's going to do it? I mean, is it going to be a committee? That'll be fun. That will be fun, and I'm not going on that committee.
A stooshy might.
No, that, yeah, not at all.
Okay.
And I have terrible, whenever I'm hearing all these different accents and dialects, I'm a terrible resist the temptation to mimic, because I just love it all of it. And there's nothing worse, you know. It's like when somebody tries to speak with an Edinburgh accent and they think they're getting it right, and you're like, no, you're not. So stop it.
Actually, I think we've got to. It's got to be a consensus, and James is outlining quite clearly for us what could be achieved. I like the idea of a standard where the dialects are respected. I don't kind of other dialects could be brought into a standard. So folk have talked about pan-dialectical standards. I'm not really sure what that is, but I certainly would want Dundonian to be part of it. But then again, you know, we could choose Dundonian as the main standard for for Scotland. But again, that wouldn't be right. Wouldn't be fair. But I think there's
nor with Edinburgh.
But to get there, there's a pool of work to be done. This isn't this is a broad discussion, and it's great. I'm enjoying it, enjoying every minute of it. But there's to get us where we are now, that a pool of work has been done, and sometimes it feels a bit like Sisyphus rolling his stone up that brae. But the stone's kind of pretty much up the brae at the moment, and the direction is up the way. There's needing to be somewhere out there an individual or a group of individuals who are happy enough to invest hours and years of their time in something that might never ever work, but which is a very Scottish thing. But it's something that I think that would need to happen. Either that, or because of the way things are working with social media and with this new technology, it's bringing us together, even though we're apart. I think it's something that maybe there's an opportunity now to try and do this. I can't mind if it was Jimmy Fairbairn, I think, up at Banff showed me this thing where folk, I think it was in Iceland or the Faroe Islands, had got had a phone app of some kind. They were all speaking in front of a waterfall, or some sort of amazing linn, or some sort of incredible landscape, and gain their words. And it seemed to me that there was, I can Icelandic or Faroese, but they were proud of it. They were showcasing their language, and they probably have standards already. But perhaps with the technology we've got now, maybe getting together, gathering, and talking about this, talking it out. Because we've not got into many spellings this evening at all. I mean, I've got my OU and double O all worked out here. I was hoping that George Fitt, the late and great George Fitt, was going to get a mention, because a lot of folk have worked at this for a long time, but we've still no racks that consensus. And until that consensus is aimed for, Ken, we'll still be talking about it forever. I hope we can mark steps for this.
And why do you think Scots criticise other Scots spelling as much as a D?
I've got a Dukie's back here. I get out of time, but you know that's the way things are when folk scream in Scots. Sometimes though, I think it's a bit. Ken, we've talked about confidence tonight. I think folk should be encouraging others, instead of sometimes when folk are making their first attempts to write in Scots, and because of the way the world is now, most things are online and folk can make their comments. I think that encouragement and easing folk up is the best way to go, especially if it's somebody new to it, because it's like going back to that laddie I was talking about. It's not 7, it's 7. Well, you know, folk just say, well, to hang with that, I'm no bothering that. I'll just do my own thing. I'll no bother writing in Scots. Why should I? I'm just going to get criticised and flight it. So positivity, I think, is the key.
That's the way you go. Absolutely.
Well, I'm conscious of time, and it's our fault that we kind of run over because we couldn't work the Facebook thingy-majig. It'd be good just to maybe wrap up and just get a wee statement for each of you. It's just maybe something a bit in conclusion to Fitt's been spoken about tonight, and just on the thoughts that you have going forward. And I'll maybe start with Bruce. Let's start with Bruce. You're doing the bottom right hand side.
Bottom right. I should be top right on the map where Shetland is.
I can. And a wee box.
Yeah.
A wee box of waffy abdales.
No, it's been a fine yarn, Phil. Thanks very much for hosting, and thanks for Oor Vyce for inviting me. And I think we've got 4 people here. We're all born in different places, different years. We're 5 of us, if you include yourself, Phil, even. And we're at an interesting discussion about it. And I think the points that we're finished on about respecting each other, being positive to newcomers, being open to each other and open to newcomers to the language, that'll be what gets us towards a better future together, I think.
Great. James, what about yourself?
I've spoken quite a lot this evening, so I'm going to try to make this relatively short. Obviously, I think you'll find very few linguists in Scotland who disagree with the idea that Scots is a language that deserves some standard, that deserves some kind of elaboration, policy and planning, what have you. I think ultimately this comes down to collective will, and it comes down to this concept we call linguistic citizenship. So we all, linguists, people who don't consider themselves linguists, members of society, poets, authors, people who write their essays, people who basically write a text to their friend, we all have a responsibility to kind of curate language in a way that, you know, sometimes can be quite ideological. But if we are determined to kind of, you know, cultivate Scots, and if a standard is what we're aiming towards, then, you know, now is a very interesting time to do it. And as long as many other people, are really excited to see what sort of conversations are going to come out of it. Obviously, I'm a big fan of diversity, and a big fan of respecting people and giving people maximum ability to write in a way that best represents how they speak. So that's my view.
Fantastic. Pauline?
Yeah, thanks to Oor Vyce for inviting me. It's been great to see everybody and have this conversation. Yes, I think if everybody gets together, I think what we have to remember is that Scots as a language is mostly mutually understandable, whether you're in Shetland or Largs, wherever. We have more in common nor we didn't. So I think if we push towards that aspect of it, then we're doing well. But I've got a tiny wee anecdote. I won't waste a lot of time, but I remember once in Tesco in Newington talking about formal registers. There was a notice put up in the store that said, messages can be uplifted out with working hours. And whoever wrote it obviously thought they were speaking proper. They had to take it down because it was near the university. An awful lot of folk who didn't speak Scots, they had no idea. Messages? Who would be leaving messages for me at Tesco? So there you go. But yes, I think we've got much more mutual intelligibility in Scots than we've got across the dialects, than we've got stuff that is there. Although when I do go to Shetland, and a few occasions I've been there, it does take me a wee minute just to tune in.
And yeah. Fantastic. What about yourself, Matthew? What would you like to
speaking as a scriver, when I first started out, I used to use umlauts and all sorts of stuff, and I worked out that nobody could understand what I was reading. That's what I was screaming. So I've developed over the years, because I would want like folk to read. Kind of, I've put effort into writing something. I would like folk to read it, and kind of, so my style or my spelling or the standard I use is developed. And if I had problems with folk criticising the way I've spelt, because folk have been banned the books, that especially the HAQ books. HAQ kind of has a kind of house style, and that's something we've worked at over the years, and folk that we were getting more and more folk doing HQ books now, and we're delighted that it's myself and James Robertson and Ken. We're not prescriptive, we just want to make sure that folk can understand what we're screaming, because we invest a lot of time into it and a lot of resources too. But I've said this already, I've come round to this. I mean, I just would like to see a standard, and I would like to see a standard created. I'm no interested in how, and I'm interested in how it happens, and I'm happy to contribute if I can. But Oor Vyce, the name of this organisation, it's Oor Vyce we're talking about, and Scots belongs to Aberdeen. So Aberdeen has a right to contribute to the creation of a standard, or Aberdeen has a right to say whether they want in or no. So we're back to this word that I think has been achieved in Norway and Catalonia, and that word is consensus.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. We do really appreciate you taking the time tonight, especially in the St Andrews night. But yeah, I mean, certainly for I'm sitting, it's been a really insightful and thought-provoking discussion that we've had. So I've certainly seen a lot of lawfu, and there's been a lot of sort of discussion on Facebook tonight, and I've not managed to totally keep up with it, but Dawn and Joanna have been sort of posting key bits that's been coming through. I'd like to thank everybody that's sort of tuned in as well on Facebook. I think we had maybe around about the 60 mark at some points on there, so I hope everybody's enjoyed it, and we'll endeavour to get a recording of this on our website. And in terms of Oor Vyce, there's obviously a lot for us to think about. Just moving into that consensus thing is working through the membership. The bigger things for me is making sure that we're connected to Ilky bit of Scotland, and all the various individuals and organisations are playing a part in it. So that's definitely a big thing on my agenda. But I'm well aware that we're 20 minutes longer than we said, so I think that's left today is raise a wee glass. So a toast to our panellists there. St Andrews night, I took a liberty of pouring myself a wee Balvenie, one of my local whiskies for him. And I wish you all a very happy St Andrews night that's left of it, and do look out for our next event. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
Cheers. Good night.
Cheers.
Bye.
Night now, bye.